Míle taigh-manachainn son bhí choireigin fáilte uile Eilean agus is a ciamar. Welcome to you, friends joining us online and those of you who are here in the room. Just tòiseachadh sreith the hemanarin ag somarostig. This is the first in our new series of seminars this autumn at Somarostig. We're really delighted to have you all here, but most especially to have Gilbert Márkus here to begin our programme and to hear from him on a topic which is so close to his research interests over many, many years. It's a real privilege to have him here. Gilbert's worked on Iona for 30 years in one way or another, beginning with his groundbreaking edition with Thomas Clancy of Iona's earliest poetry, and been returning to it over many, many years in one way or another, whether it's to do with place names or to do with history. The really significant historical publication, Scotland's History up to 900, isn't it? Conceiving a Nation, which Gilbert wrote some 10 years or so ago now. Is hugely richly informed by Gilbert's reading of sources written in Iona, written about Iona, and all of that knowledge and research fed into his role as one of the researchers on the Glasgow University project, which is just coming to an end, funded by the AHRC, looking at Iona's places, names, spaces, from a whole variety of interesting perspectives, not just of onomastics, but archaeology, ecology, history, and all sorts of things. And I think it's drawing on that richness of approach that Gilbert's going to be speaking to us today, talking about one aspect of the way in which Iona is constructed, created, and understood, and the ways in which that draws on ideas from both inside and outside. So it's a huge pleasure to ask him to address us today on his topic, Imitating Rome, Imitating Jerusalem, Iona and Spatial Meaning in the 7th Century.
Mhór taigh Abby. Hamidúlacha, Cadir Mhór an Galach acum.
And you're Shinfiriji.
Bimia Bruins, Saverla. Well, thank you very much, Abby, and thank you to all you people here and online for your interest in this obsession of mine, which has haunted me. Abby and I were talking about how Iona and I have been mutually haunted. I've haunted Iona as often as I can, and Iona has been haunting me since the mid-1990s. So I'm going to talk about this aspect of my work with the Iona's Namescape project at Glasgow University. Oh, that arrow's not going.
Try the right-hand one.
This one.
That one.
That is?
No.
Let me see if I can. Not right.
Talk about
There we go.
Oh.
So working with Thomas Owen Clancy, Alistair White, Mary MacArthur, Catherine Forsyth, and myself, looking at Iona's Namescape. The official title, the subtitle of the project is Place Names and Their Dynamics. And I'm the only person who's really narrowly focused on medieval things in my interest. All these other people have got lots of other strings to their bow. And the problem is that we only have, we're talking about the landscape of names.
Negative. I could just know Jared.
Oh, did he? Oh.
Getting a bit technical there. The landscape of names, but in my period of interest, we only have 3 names for the whole of Iona in the first millennium. So that makes it a bit difficult for me to immerse myself in place names. I could spend 5 years looking at those 3 names. I have actually, but there are other things to look at as well. So I've been looking more at the way the landscape itself, physical landscape, is created and constructed with meanings. The way people use language and monuments and buildings and walls and gates and other features of the landscape to create a landscape charged with meaning of various sorts. every church in Christendom is in some sense a machine for collapsing space. That what you do in a church, you sing psalms, which are constantly referring to the place that you are as Jerusalem. I rejoiced when they told me, come and let us go to God's house, and now our feet are standing in your gates, O Jerusalem. The medieval Irish rite for the consecration of a church mentions Jerusalem all the time in its psalms and its prayers. Every church is a Jerusalem. What you do in the church, you reenact that moment, the moments of the death and resurrection of Christ. You reenact the meal where he shared himself in the signs of bread and wine. And you do this regularly in your church, and you're making your church present to those events that took place 2,000 years ago, or 800 years ago in the case of Adam, 700 years. And Jerusalem really has three different kinds of meaning. There's the biblical Jerusalem, the Jerusalem where David built his capital. There's the Jerusalem of the two temples. There's the Jerusalem of the prophets that they wept over and accused of failing. There's the Jerusalem of Christ and his life and death and resurrection. This biblical Jerusalem. For a medieval writer, there's also the present day Jerusalem. What does that look like on the ground today? And there's also this sense that Jerusalem is where we are all called to in literary and liturgical. So we talk about the heavenly Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of hope, of expectation, the eternal Jerusalem, which is not a particular place. It's an eschatological event, if you like. So Jerusalem is a hugely important, powerful, multi-layered symbol for medieval Christians as their self-understanding of what they individually do, but what they also do as communities, and how they imagine and construct their spaces and what they mean by their spaces. I don't have time to go into all this now, but there's a lot of work being done on the way that early medieval churches were built to represent in some symbolic way the Ark of the Covenant and then the Jerusalem Temple. So those kinds of issues. And let me just say, the keyhole through which I want to look today is the writing of Eilean Idhe, the 9th abbot of Iona, died in 704. Two great works that he wrote. One was the Life of Columba, and one was De Loci Sanctis, on the holy places. He claimed that a shipwrecked Gaulish bishop washed up on Iona and told him all about the Holy Land and what it was like and what the buildings were like and what people did there, and drew little maps for him. So we have some of the earliest known medieval plans and maps of buildings come from the pen of Iona originally, come from the pen of Eilean through various subsequent copyists, obviously, in later manuscripts. So I've spoken a bit about this already. So this is one of those famous plans. It's the De Loci Sanctis is a 7th century text. The manuscript itself is a bit later, I think maybe 9th century or 10th century. So on the right here, you have the square building, which is the Constantinian Basilica, the round building to the left. These are the two key moments, I think, in our architectural survey. The round building to the left is the burial place of Christ. There are various other buildings dotted about, as we'll see. But at this point, just notice that a big square church, a big round church, and various smaller churches dotted about. There's a Golgotha ecclesia, which has the true cross in it, allegedly. There's a St. Mary's church to the south, and then immediately to the west of the big square church is the chapel of the chalice that Christ used at the Last Supper. There's just beginning to get a picture of how space creates liturgical ritual landscape through buildings, and the whole thing surrounded, of course, by muri, by walls. Thomas O'Loughlin has commented very interestingly on De Loci Sanctis. One of the things for him, significantly, was it presents us with exegetical questions. That when monks are reading, or scholars are reading the Gospels, there are all kinds of questions that arise in their minds about how these spaces looked. How did it work walking from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, or whatever it might be? Are there ambiguities in the text that can be resolved by looking at particular aspects of the landscape, which will make everything clear? So for O'Loughlin, this is the De Loci Sanctis is created, in his perspective, largely to deal with these scholarly conundrums about understanding a text and you shed light on that text, according to good old-fashioned Augustinian doctrine, by finding out about topography, buildings, language, and so on, technical disciplines which shed light on theological meaning. But Amy Mulligan produced a very different, and they're not mutually exclusive, explanations of the De Loci Sanctis. Adamnon imparts an immediate experience of these places via Arkel's body and impressions, allowing us to be imaginatively present on the pilgrimage. So what she's highlighting is not simply the physical landscape and the monuments and everything, but also the way people behave. They visit churches, they honour the tombs of saints, processions, liturgies, kissing and touching relics, and so on. There's a whole lot of things which are what happens when a landscape is holy. When a landscape is holy, it generates all kinds of ritual, liturgical, and other responses. She has also suggested that in the case of the Holy Land, a landscape is holy and it gives rise to all these responses from the devotees. If you read the De Loci Sanctis as one half of a diptych, the other half being the life of Columba, many of these rituals are repeated in the life of Columba. So you have a Holy Land creating rituals. In the life of Columba, you have rituals which declare a land holy. There's a kind of translocation, if you like, of the holiness of the Holy Land via the medium of ritual activity to the landscape of the Hebrides. This is very much part of a thing. It means that we can recreate that Jerusalem experience here on Iona or wherever you happen to be, sort of virtual pilgrimages, you could say. Tommaso Caragon's work has also explored the spatial aspects of early medieval church layout. And he talks about the imitation of Jerusalem, where the tomb of Christ, you remember that large round building lying immediately west of the basilica? This pattern is repeated in Irish and Western Scottish churches. A little shrine with a body in it, or had once had a body in it, immediately to the west of the main congregational church. So he's seeing an imitation of Jerusalem, and that is exactly the layout that we have in Iona. So if you make a little schematic diagram of what we've got here, in Jerusalem at the Holy Sepulchre, you've got the burial in the round church, you've got the main Constantinian basilica, you've got the cross in the Golgotha chapel that we saw on that plan. And exactly the same layout is apparent on Iona, the church. The burial is that small, possibly 8th or 9th century shrine just outside what is now the west door of the larger Abbey church. The original Abbey church won't have been that big, but it probably was on the same site, but further east. So its altar would have probably been where the modern altar is, or the medieval altar is now. So there will have been a gap between the Iona church and its burial ground. And it's interesting that Adamnon uses the term platea for it's the piazza. It's where the word piazza comes from, or plaza in Latin, in Spanish, is the square paved ground outside the church. And Adamnon uses exactly the same term, both for the Jerusalem site and for the Iona site, describing that. But there are some inconsistencies from what we know about Jerusalem from archaeology. There are strange things. In real life, the edicula, the shrine chapel of the Holy Sepulchre, is smaller than the Constantinian Basilica. Here, it looks bigger. Adamnon's made it look much bigger than it is. And the orientation of the basilica, like many Constantinian churches, the entrance is at the east side and the altar at the west end. And that's completely unlike most medieval churches, which Adamnan would have been familiar with. So he has reversed the direction. He's got the doors here at the west side, implying that the altar is here. So you've got your back to the sepulchre, whereas this would have given you a view through the arches of the apse right directly onto the sepulchre. So that when you're lifting the body of Christ on the altar in the Eucharist, the risen Christ, crucified and risen one, you're looking through that to the physical object, the monument of that event. Constantine's complex is actually an integrated whole, a single building of many parts, but it's all built together as a single thing. Adamnan shows it as multiple buildings, all separated from each other, very much like an early medieval church in the Gaeltacht, as they didn't have big cloisters and interconnected buildings like that. So as O'Callaghan says, it's been filtered through an insular something, mind or imagination or something. I can't remember what the term he uses is. Nothing else. So there are inconsistencies, which makes it slightly suspicious. If Arculf had spent months there praying and wandering around and talking to people and engaging devoutly with all these monuments, why doesn't he know where the doors for the Constantinian Basilica are? Thomas O'Loughlin has suggested that it's possible that Arculf is a figment of Adamnan's imagination. He didn't exist, but he's been made up as a useful way of giving authority to his description of the place. Because most of the information that Adamnan has about the holy places could have been garnered from earlier writings by people who did know, like Jerome, for example. So that's an interesting possibility. Maybe Arculf isn't there, and so this picture of with a direct witness from Jerusalem to Iona is maybe slightly less certain than we thought. Ewan Campbell and Adrian Maldonado at Glasgow University, archaeologists, have done a lot of work on this, and their article, A New Jerusalem at the Ends of the Earth, sees the earthly monastery as a mirror of the heavenly Jerusalem, but not just the heavenly Jerusalem. Remember, there are three layers to Jerusalem. So it's the biblical Jerusalem and the present-day Jerusalem, which Arculf has meant to be seen, and the heavenly Jerusalem, which we're all hoping for. So they produced various other echoes of Jerusalem spatial organization, if you like, and literary echoes of Jerusalem on Iona, and developed that quite a lot. So that's their plan of the layout, the relative layouts, with the plateo or platiola. Adamnan's very much given to using diminutives when he's writing in Latin things. So they have the cross. They think that St. Mary's might correspond to St. Oran's. St. Mary's is in Jerusalem, St. Oran's on Iona. They think that the chalice might correspond to the well, which is just outside the west door of the Iona church. I have my doubts about that, partly because the chalice is to do with wine, and therefore the blood of Christ and the Eucharist, while the well is to do with baptism, with water and baptism. Therefore, there's kind of material inconsistency between the chalice and the well. I'll come back to that shortly. But they're developing this way of thinking about Iona as Jerusalem further. I've wondered if the well outside the west end of the church doesn't reflect the actual baptistry in Constantine's Jerusalem, which is outside and slightly decentered from the church's axis. We know about that from early visitors who did visit Jerusalem, but the thing is, Adamnan doesn't mention the well or the baptistry in Jerusalem. He doesn't know anything about it. So whenever this well in Iona came from, it can't have come from Arculf's description of Jerusalem, because Arculf didn't describe it as far as we can tell. So it may have come from some other description of Jerusalem, or, as we shall see, description of somewhere else. But in any case, my feeling is that we should locate the well with a baptistry of some description. Dh'fhaodadh, the Street of the Dead, is a very unusual monument for its period, 8th, 9th century, probably 8th century, leading from the harbour past several churches and cemeteries. Its routeway is really important. The road connects holy places. We'll come back to that shortly. So one or two people have suggested that it's actually a rather Roman-looking road, as we'll see in a second, so although it's grassed over. Does it reflect the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem? But the Via Dolorosa is actually quite a late development in Jerusalem space, and Adamnon doesn't mention it. So whatever the origin of the Via in Iona is, it can't be Adamnon's Jerusalem or Arcroft's Jerusalem. Well, Carnegon compares Iona with Armagh. Armagh is seeking to make itself the chief church of the Gaels. It boasts about it. It's got relics of Peter and Paul and Lawrence and Stephen. It wants to assert itself. You know, the guardian of the relics is the coadh. He's the person who has the authority which they inherit with the relics to run the church. Claiming to be the Rome of all the Irish, as Armagh was, and using these relics to do so is quite interesting. But in a situation where Armagh and Iona are, to some extent, at loggerheads, at least rivals for authority, and Iona doesn't want to accept Armagh's superiority. As O'Callaghan suggests, that Jerusalem is the model for Iona, while Rome is the model for Armagh, and they're using these two holy places as rival tokens. I don't think that would necessarily work very well myself, and we'll come back to that shortly. And I'm not sure Iona, O'Callaghan talked about the Iona, the worldly interests of Armagh. I don't imagine that Iona was entirely free of worldly interests. And Campbell and Maldonado also talk about Adamnon's focus on Jerusalem, differentiating it from Armagh's practice referencing Rome. Remember, Rome is the place of the holy martyrs, especially Peter and Paul, and Armagh's got them and is using them to claim authority. But, as we shall see, it's not quite as simple as that. This is a portrait of Rome in the 4th century, time of Constantine. Constantine went on a big church basilica building rampage around Rome, having accepted Christianity as a legitimate. It's only a few years after the Diocletian persecution, but he writes an edict of toleration. Christianity will now be tolerable in the Roman Empire. He himself has become some kind of a Christian. We're not entirely clear how much conviction there was involved in that. But what's interesting about this plan is how all the churches are outside the city walls, almost all. They're all named after Roman martyrs, and those ancient Constantinian churches are built on the site of the tombs of those martyrs, which became gathering places for the early Christians during times of persecution. They're all Roman martyrs, except for a few in the southeast corner. You see Santa Croce there, and the Lateran Basilica. The Lateran was dedicated to Christ. It's the Ecclesia Sancti Salvatoris, the Church of the Holy Saviour. It later acquired a John dedication as well, but that's a much later development. So there's the cross and the Saviour are not Roman martyrs, obviously, and they're inside the city. And the Lateran Basilica is actually, from an ecclesiastical politics point of view, is much more important than St. Peter's. St. Peter's has got the relics, but the Lateran Basilica is the cathedral church of Rome. It's where the bishop has his see. It's where he exercises his authority, makes his judgments, teaches the gospel. Over the door it says Mater Magistra Omnium Ecclesiarum or something, the mistress and mother of all the churches. So there's something interesting going on in this southeast corner. And I'll zoom in on that corner, and you have the Lateran Basilica, named after the Saviour. You've got St. Stephen, the first martyr, whose shrine is in Jerusalem, his original shrine. This is a new shrine, and it's to the west of the basilica. You've got Santa Croce in Jerusalem. That's a bit of a giveaway. You've got the baptistry of San Giovanni, that's John the Baptist, in Fonte, immediately outside and to the west of the basilica. and you've got Santa Maria Maggiore in the north. They define the scope of the Borgo Laterale, the borough in the New York sense of borough, you know, the way cities are divided up. So this is a zone. All these churches are served by clergy from the Lateran Basilica, okay? And they move from one church to the other. So although the Lateran Basilica is the central point, they move around from one church to another and processions on particular feast days. And so they're all those churches, it's a web. And remember how that plan of Jerusalem was dislocated chapels and churches, creating a landscape, not an integrated building, but multiple centres. And they're all biblical dedications, not Roman martyrs. And they seem to echo deliberately the spatial organisation of Jerusalem. So you have the Lateran Basilica, dedicated to the Saviour, and the baptistry to the west, just off the axis, to the north of the Basilica's axis. In Jerusalem, you have the big Basilica and the baptistry just to the west, and again, off-centred. And remember, that baptistry does not exist in Arculf's testimony to Adamnon. So wherever the well outside the west door of Iona came from, it can't have come from Arculf or Adamnon. But it might have come from Rome. This is part of what got me thinking about this next step of imitation, if you like. Santo Stefano Rotondo is a round church. It is 4 centimeters smaller than the round church in Jerusalem. Okay, very close. It's a copy of the Holy Sepulchre Church, and it's, you know, just as the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is a commemoration of Christ, the martyr of all martyrs, if you like, the one who laid down his life for his sheep. Santo Stefano, St. Stephen, is the proto-martyr, the first martyr, and he's recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. So this is in a sense, it is a tomb shrine, although there isn't necessarily a tomb in it, or they will have had relics, or did have relics. But it's echoing this, both the formal, the square church and round church of Jerusalem. It's got a square church and a round church in Rome. It's got the spatial arrangement lying to the west of it, and it's got this commemoration of the death of the martyr embedded in its liturgy. And it's connected by processions, especially on the Feast of St. Stephen on the 26th of December. So, enough for the moment about Santo Stefano. Santa Croce, remember there was a chapel of the cross on Golgotha in Jerusalem. Santa Croce, built in the late 4th century, so not actually in Constantine's time, but by one of his successors, dedicated to the Holy Cross with a relic of the cross, which was brought from Jerusalem. And it's called, in 5th century Roman, it's simply called Jerusalem in 5th century Roman literature. On Good Friday, there is this ritual of the veneration of the cross, in which the Pope barefoot carries the cross in procession from the Lateran to Santa Croce, which is exactly the same ritual as happens in Jerusalem, recorded even earlier in Hegelia's Spanish nuns' visit to Jerusalem in 385, I think it was, something like that. So that you can see not only is there's a spatial echo of the Jerusalem landscape, there is also this ritual, that the ritual of procession is imitated from Jerusalem to Rome. And it's interesting that Adamnon doesn't mention such processions of the cross in his descriptions of Rome, and that's because the cross has by this time gone to Constantinople, and he does describe it in Constantinople. So how the Roman procession is something drawn directly from Jerusalem to Rome in its ritual. Finally, Santa Maria Maggiore, 5th century church, a bit later than the other ones, again staffed by Lateran clergy. It's a bit further away. It has the stational mass on Christmas Day. Now, in the Holy Land, on Christmas Day, the Pope would walk from Rome to Bethlehem. So it's 5 miles. It's a good walk, and they would be singing and so on during the procession. The procession itself is not just a way of getting there, it's a liturgical event in its own right. And it's recorded by Hegeria in her travels in the 4th century, about 385. It's not in De Loci Sanctis, it is in Rome. And I imagine it's actually quite likely to have been done on Iona as well. It's known as Ad Praesepe, at the manger, the church. And then if you look at the mosaics over the altar, over the sanctuary, here and here, you've got a picture of Jerusalem and a picture of Bethlehem. In Jerusalem, you can see the round burial chapel and the basilica and a couple of other buildings. They're not very good at perspective, so they're not properly orientated, but not bad for a 5th century artist. And what's interesting is it shows, in a sense, what Christ, it's the arc of Christ's life. He was born in Bethlehem on the right-hand side, and this arc of mosaics reflecting his life and also biblical prototypes for his life, prophetic foreshadowings, as it were, going over to the left-hand side to Jerusalem, where he died and rose again. So, but it's also an echo of the papal procession from Jerusalem in the Lateran to Bethlehem at Santa Maria Maggiore. So, the reenactment of Christ's life in the procession from one to the other is quite significant here, I think. Well, that's just a close-up of Jerusalem with the special buildings. So what I would like to suggest is that the Borgo Laterano, with its peculiar collection of non-Roman dedications, biblical dedications, represents the Jerusalem topography, but filtered through a Roman mind. And this might also be Jerusalem's, that might be Iona's methodology as well, filtering it through a Roman mind. We have dh'fhaodadh. Adnan doesn't know anything about it, but it's there on Iona. He doesn't know anything about a via in Jerusalem. He doesn't mention any via in Jerusalem. It's not a significant part of the Jerusalem landscape, but it's a massively significant part of the Roman landscape. So all the early 7th century itineraries of Rome, there are 4 in the 7th century, and they all describe the approach to the city along viae, the Via Appia. Do I have? No, I don't. So the holiness of the city is embodied or embedded in roads passing cemeteries and churches, and the martyrs or the saints who are culted in those churches. So it's a landscape created by people on foot, traveling from through these churches, strung out like beads on a necklace along the viae. The viae are a really important part of Roman pilgrimage and ritual. They're totally insignificant in Adamnon's Jerusalem, so he can't have got it from there. But this is exactly the same in Iona. You have burial grounds and crosses and churches all the way from the harbour, the medieval harbour, is a bit south of the modern one, along the Stratton and Marth, through various levels of enclosure until you get to the Shrine of Columba and the great monastic church in its centre of concentric enclosures. Another thing that struck me is Adamnon describes the route that Arculf took, the mythical Arculf, we might call him, from Jerusalem and the Holy Land, around the Mediterranean, and eventually to Rome. And he ends up at Rome, and then there's a very slight mention of volcanoes elsewhere, but that's a kind of side issue. the end of his journey is in Rome. He's bringing this mythical figure, if he exists, he's bringing his knowledge of the Holy Land to Rome. Just as we see in St. Paul's final journey in the Acts of the Apostles, he leaves the Holy Land. So he's Arculf is to some extent reenacting the journey of St. Paul. There are slight differences, most critically to Constantinople, which was by this time the imperial city for the whole of the Roman Empire. And it's where the Holy Cross now was. So in Paul's time, the cross was still in Jerusalem. By now it's in Constantinople. So he makes a little detour that way. But otherwise, it's a pretty close. Arculf is following in the footsteps of St. Paul. Another really interesting thing is, remember I said that we can treat the De Loci Sanctis and the Vita Columbae as a diptych, as two facing texts. They both finish off with Rome. So the reputation of Columba in this small and remote island, not so far from here, his name is renowned throughout Britain and Ireland, three-cornered Spain, Italy, and even the Roman city, which is the chief of all cities. So Adamnon is leading us in our imagination from Iona to Rome as a kind of vision of where the glory of St. Columba has gone. In the conclusion of the De Loci Sanctis, he says the holy priest Arculf stayed in Constantinople until Christmas and then took the ship from there for Rome, which is where he ended up. So there's a kind of mirroring of these two texts and how things are drawn to Rome. Cultural influence, town planning, cult of saints, whatever you want to call it. I think that's a significant parallelism as well. So just briefly to sum up, if you think about features on Iona that we know are there, several of them are in Adamnon's Jerusalem, but not all of them. But they are all in Rome. So I'm suggesting that we can see Iona as a replication of Jerusalem, certainly filtered through an insular mind, but not only, but filtered through Rome's replication of Jerusalem. And so this is also a way of countering the claims of Armagh. Armagh is representing itself as the chief church because it has all the Roman relics. But Iona has replicated the sacred landscape of Jerusalem as it was replicated in Rome. And not only in Rome, but in the Pope's chief church and its surrounding Borgo. So, to be honest, I don't see how saying to Armagh, we're not really Roman, but that makes us just as important as you. That's not a very good rhetorical stance. But if you say, we're just as Roman as you because we've organized our church along the Roman model, and we've organized it along the Roman imitation of Jerusalem, that's a slightly better rhetorical stand to resist Armagh's expanding claims. So that's about it, I think.
Well, thank Gilbert. What an interesting set of propositions and all sorts of things to explore there. Maybe if we stop sharing on that screen, we'll be able to see everybody online. So if you see the red thing up there.
Stop sharing, yeah. There we go.
Shared Lena, everybody who's online, I can't see you all at once very easily. So if you'd like to ask a question, it would be great if you could put a put your hand up in the chat function, or write a message in the chat box so that I know that you're waiting with a question. I see that we've got a question already from Keith Briggs, so why don't we start with that and then maybe come to somebody in the room. Keith, would you like to?
Oh, yes, thank you. Very interesting talk. Thank you. I'm a little bit familiar with the history of Peterborough Abbey in Eastern England, and it also had a period in the 12th and 13th century when it promoted itself as the second Rome, or the daughter of Rome. I'm not sure whether anyone's looked at the topography of the abbey layout in the way you've done for Iona. But I also I suspect, although I can't point you to other examples, this is quite a common thing. The second Rome.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, that's my question is, to what extent is Iona different from these other instances of churches or abbeys or trying to do the same sort of thing?
I think people used different symbols to represent their own Romanitas. So Amar was using relics. It may also have been using topographic and ritual, the rituals of procession which connect different elements in the topography. It may have been using those too. We do have some 7th century indications of Roman ritual. In the Liber Angeli, for example, it talks about processing to the church of the martyrs of the relics of the martyrs, for example. But they were primarily, I think, using just the sheer possession of Roman martyrs as their principal sign of Romanitas. Now, Iona doesn't seem to have been able to do that. It might have had Columba's body, but it didn't have any Roman relics, as far as we know.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to look at different ways of symbolizing their own Romanness. I mean, everybody wants to be Roman, basically, in some sense,
Yes.
but they just have different ways, want to have different ways of showing it. And, didn't Charlemagne call his palace in Aachen the Lateranum, Palatium Lateranum, I think? That people just thought, how am I going to make myself look good? And that means looking Roman. And they would see whatever option they could, and it might be simply the shape of a church or some symbolic measurement in the church, that some churches seem to have used proportions of length to breadth or some other feature as ways of aligning themselves with Rome.
Yes, and in the case of Peterborough, of course, the dedication to Peter is part of the.
That's a bit of a giveaway.
and it's not just the first part of the name Peterborough, but the second, borough. It was used alone initially without the Peter, and the meaning was in fact city.
Yeah,
a special meaning of the English. Old English word was developing to city.
yeah.
Mila, thank you.
Thank you.
I know Duncan's waiting, but ceacht Gilbert, I wondered that I was really struck by what you were talking about at the beginning about the making by doing aspect of the way that you need to think about engaging with the spaces and the way people would use space and what using space brings in terms of developing a sense of holiness in the way that people used the space that they were walking through, working through, inhabiting in different ways. And I suppose in a way it made me think of what we're very used to talking about in much more contemporary terms of the tourist gaze. And it struck me as something that's so different from the way that I've always thought about monastic space as being for the people who lived and worked in the monastery. And actually what you're suggesting sounds like it's hugely importantly orientated towards visitors who come for whatever reason and their experience of being part of the landscape and using the landscape and being shown it. And that idea that the via is important because it's as you take people in and you say, here's the important dead person, here's the important place where you get baptized, here's the important place where such and such happened. Actually, what you're doing is communicating a story to people who aren't on the inside of it all the time. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what that meant for the way that Iona was used or could have been trying to be used.
There is a clear. I'm a little bit ambivalent about this because there is a clear spatial hierarchy on Iona, created by walls and spaces and crosses and movement along the via, and we know from both the archaeology and contemporary texts in the 8th century Collectio Canonum Hibernensis that there is a description of the proper way of organizing a church, a holy place, which has Sanctus, Sanctior, Sanctissimus, the holy, the holier, and the holiest, as you gradually move towards the centre, and there are boundaries which you cross, and every boundary you cross, you get closer to the holiest place, and the gaps through those boundaries are protected symbolically by the erection of crosses at the boundaries. So when you cross, there's a kind of blessing, and the outer level is full of demons. There's a miracle in the life of Columba where a monk inadvertently fills a milk bucket with milk, puts a lid on it, and forgets to bless it before he put the milk in the pot. And he brings it to Columba, and then suddenly the milk bucket explodes in the presence of the saint, because it has a demon inside it, and he's brought it from the outer edge of the periphery of the monastery, which is outside the holy enclosure. He's brought it in with its demon inside it, and there's a conflict of spiritual forces, which results in the destruction of the bucket and the escape of the demon. It's actually a story probably borrowed from Gregory's dialogues about another saint, but that's neither here nor there. But the idea that you move through space into ever increasing areas of holiness is significant, and it's not just in the peculiarly organized churches of the Gallic world. You get the same in much later monastic formal architecture, where you have single coherent buildings, but they're laid out, actually, if you analyze the space syntax, the way that movement creates hierarchy of spiritual power, if you like, or purity, what holiness is. Although they looked very different, they had a scatter of small huts and dotted boundaries around the place. But if you analyze these spaces according to spatial syntax, it looks very much like the spatial syntax of a big 13th, 14th century monastic building. Very different formally, different materials, different in scale, differences in integration or disintegration, but the spatial syntax of movement into increasing holiness is very much present in both those building types. But having said all that, clearly they are having this thing going on about visitors and non-monastics. There's an interesting feature of Adamnon's life of Columba. He talks about Columba's power to heal, and nobody from outside the monastery ever gets healed on Iona. Columba is healing people all over the British Isles, in Ireland and Scotland, well, Pictland as it then is, and in mainland's dheireadh. He never heals an outsider on Iona. He doesn't want people. In fact, there's one person who comes to Iona suffering from a disease and says, "Please, Columba, heal me." And Columba says, "You're going to be dead in a week." You know, so Adamnon is actually arguing against visitors, or at least visitors coming to seek healing. If you look at Cogitosa's life of Bridget, he celebrates the fact that the whole monastery is full of thousands of visitors who come to her shrine and pray for healing. And Adamnon has completely the opposite view. He says, you know, keep away. He can heal you. He can heal you at a distance. Stay at home and, you know, pay your dues or say your prayers. Sing that Gallic hymn that is so famous, whenever it is. We don't know what it was. But people were saved by singing a hymn in honor of Columba. But don't come to, he's really saying, don't come to Columba. And he has Columba policing the boundaries very firmly. And lay visitors don't get, they get pretty short shrift on the island. They get sent away mostly. So there's a kind of tension between what you're saying about this visitor culture and the gaze of the visitor, the pilgrim, which is not quite the same as the tourist gaze, but you know, still. My dad used to always tell a story about he was standing outside Chartres once, and a busload of people got off, and somebody said, "We've only got half an hour. You do the inside, I'll do the outside." So. You know, there is a kind of gaze which is simply consumerism, and I don't think that's what the pilgrims are about. But anyway, so there is that going on, but there's also this hostility to visitors and the disruption that visitors bring to the peace and tranquility of a properly monastic enclosure. You know.
Thank you. Right, there's a queue
Sorry.
There's a cue in the computer. Are you going to hear something stuff?
Yeah, thanks very much, Gilbert. As always, a very interesting talk that just opens up so many passageways to go down, and delighted not least that one of the two stories of demonically possessed milk buckets managed to make it into your answer there. I think with regard to the sort of anti-pilgrimage agenda that comes through, I think it's not coincidental that Adamnan has this terrible storm when Columba is being buried that prevents anybody coming to the funeral from outside, which I think quite clearly plays into that as well. But the point that I wanted to bring up was to maybe slightly push back against or to slightly query the distinction between water and wine that you were making in talking about the spatial layout of the monastery. Where I think you were critiquing, was it Maldonado's topography there? Because water and wine, yeah, I mean, they are indeed obviously two distinct substances, but they're theologically quite closely linked ones.
Yes.
Not only because obviously Christ turns the water into wine in what in the Gospel of John is his first publicly visible miracle, a sign, but Adamnan himself also uses that in Book 2 of the Vita in chapter 1. So the first miracle in the Book of Miracles is Columba doing the same thing, is turning water into wine to make that available for the Eucharist.
Yeah.
So I think that the water and wine are as closely connected as they are substantially different, and that might also be part of the topography there.
I agree. And interestingly, in the ancient Eucharistic liturgy, there's when the wine is being prepared to be blessed for the Eucharist, there's a mingling of water and wine that takes place, and a prayer by the mingling of this water and wine, where we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. So that there's a kind of water represents humanity and wine represents divinity.
Mm-hmm.
And so I agree that they're not totally incompatible. And that's a perfectly good question, I think, about my reading of the well. But the well, as a monument, it's people get baptized in wells and they get baptized in rivers. Before they started building actual baptistries, an open spring was a standard place of baptism and not a standard place of Eucharist. And the baptistry in Jerusalem is in exactly the same topographical space as the well in Iona to the west of the basilica, and it's not mentioned by Adamnan, and it is there in Rome. I mean, I see your point, and I think it's a fair point, and I wouldn't want to rule out any Eucharistic symbolism with connecting with the chalice. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say was with regard to Rome's. I think it is the Martyrology of Angus, possibly Tallaght, but I think Angus, which refers to the little Romes. The churches that are sprouting up all over Ireland and routing. The I mean, they're not called little Jerusalems; they're little Romes.
Exactly.
Which is maybe an indication of how widely spread this is. Yeah,
Rua. Also, in the poem by Dalon Forgo, the dh'fhaodadh, written supposedly shortly after his death, although possibly re-edited in the 9th century, there's a phrase describing Columba's preaching activity, his mission of spreading Christianity. It says, Rophes Ruav, Rome was made known. Rome is simply another word for Christianity in that context, But as Duncan says, it's also another word for a church or a churchyard. We're surrounded by many little Romes. So they're thinking of themselves as replicating Romanness as much as they're thinking of Jerusalem. It's interesting in the consecration rites, they tend not to use Rome as an image quite so much. It's always Jerusalem. The Psalms are from the Psalms of Ascent, the Psalms about approaching Jerusalem. Those are the ones that are used in the Irish consecration rites. But Rome is certainly an important part of how people understand it.
Lisa Shulman. No.
Can I ask what are the three
Sorry?
what are the three early place names recorded in Iona?
itself,
Uh-huh.
that's Iwa Insula. So Adam has a habit of Latinizing and putting little suffixes.
Yeah.
So he puts this ua at the end of e. Then there's Gilbert, which is we don't really know much about. We know roughly where it is. It's on the road from one side of the island to the other. And close by the Gilbert is Croc-Angle, the Hill of the Angels, which he translates as Colliculus Angelorum. So I think that's about it.
Thank you.
And they're all ritual places. They're places of divine encounters.
John Rafferty, next in the queue in the computer.
We're not holding and keeping anybody out, are we?
No. They can. Anybody who needs to escape can escape, but we can keep going. John. Oh, you're still on mute.
That's better, I think, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. First of all, Gilbert, thanks very much. Really interesting. This question might be slightly off-piste, but I was trying to make connections back from our current times. Do you think the digital age has anything to say in keeping the story going to recreate Jerusalem? I'm asking that. I mean, I'm a Roman Catholic Christian, and I'm thinking back to the COVID years, of tuning into mass online, and so on. But is this anywhere? Is this potential? Does it have anything to say to keeping the story going? I think I'm asking.
I can see the possibilities of the internet as a way of spreading ideas and things, but I'm very reluctant to allow it to become terribly significant. We are bodies. We are physically present to each other. We break bread and share wine. We rub each other with oil. We have sex occasionally. All our sacraments they all require physical presence. And I think it's a big mistake to think it's a kind of Cartesianization. We're not just I'm not just a res cogitans capable of absorbing and emitting information. I'm primarily a snuffling, limping, snorting physical presence. With other physical presences around me. I'm not dissing all you people who are here online. Maybe I have a room full of charming people here who gave me a sandwich.
Indeed.
But I want to. The word was made flesh, and we don't want to make it back into a whole bunch of more words. I'm a great believer in physical, sensual, bodily enactment and presence. The church is. I've read recently people attempting to say, we ought to be able to have confession online. You have a confess to a priest online and get absolution and do your go away and say a few prayers. I'm dead against it. You need to have a body laying hands on you if necessary and whatever. Or giving you a good skull.
Interesting. I think I'm in the same queue as yourself. I was curious about linking back and pulling forward. Was what's interesting. Many thanks.
We've got to stay online for the next question. I feel bad. But Justin Coots, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, Gilbert, and thank you. That's good to see you. Thank you for your talk. Yeah, when you were talking about the sort of the holy, the holier, and the holiest as areas in the ritual landscape, my mind was going to some of my more obscure reading in Maximus Confessor and his mystagogy, which lays out the church structure following the traditional sort of threefold path of purification, illumination, and union. And when you were describing the bucket and the demon, that fit very well, because the purification stage of the first part is always about expelling demons, which are symbolically vices and passions and things, of course. And so that's all statements. But my question is, do you think that they would have had any sense of that? Would that have been part of the ritual, that there was this threefold path that is embedded in the more mystical Eastern, if you want to call it, tradition, although it's everywhere, you know.
Yes, I don't know if they would have. I don't know if they were eating Maximus or not on Iona. But there are lots of places in patristic writing, but also in liturgy. I think, you know, if you think of, for example, the liturgical rite, the first stage of the liturgical rite is exorcism. And then there's illumination, you get given a candle, and then you are baptized, you die into Christ. And there's a process of theosis, or deification, divinization. You begin to share the divine nature. I don't think it's always a threefold division. I think that sense of progress can be subdivided in various ways. And interestingly, in the Collectio Canonum Heidelbergensis, there are various manuscript readings of just how many stages of increasing holiness there are. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 4, and they're not obsessed with 3-ness as some people are, but Augustine was. You can see 3s everywhere. But yeah, I think I wouldn't point necessarily to Maximus or even to the East. I think it's a fairly universal. And I think, as I was saying earlier, those increasing layers of holiness as you enter, in spatial terms, are common to lots of different monastic types of building or buildings. I read something recently by archaeologists looking at early monastic settlements in the first 5 centuries, and comparing them to the surrounding settlements. And to a great extent, they are an Egyptian monastic settlement is archaeologically indistinguishable from a monastic Egyptian farming settlement in the desert. They use the same building types, they use very similar topographical arrangements. And the same is true, you know, Columbanus, when he came to Gaul, he didn't build a monastery from scratch. He went and squatted in old ruined Roman forts and villas. And that was a very common pattern as well. Urban monasteries were very often, a bishop would create a monastery beside his cathedral. And so there were urban monasteries even quite early on. And they're, again, archaeologically indistinguishable. So, but there must have been they nevertheless talk about enclosure and separation, even in those buildings which are archaeologically indistinguishable from the surrounding buildings. They're ideologically distinguishable because they have some sense of how there is an external, there are levels of sanctity, and therefore exclusion. You have to have the right to exclude people who are not part of your community. And sometimes it's articulated not in the way you treat the living, but in the way you treat the dead. So I strongly suspect that in Iona, you've got monks buried in the immediate vicinity of the abbey and the shrine of Columba. You've got laymen buried around St. Ornan, and the next layer out. And then you've got women buried around Champel Ronan, which is a layer further out again. So the exclusion, the kind of categorization of people and who is it appropriate to have in which space and at what times. It may be very well that, you know, a place is reserved only for monks and clergy most of the time, but on a particular feast day, everybody comes in and does their thing. No doubt under close supervision. And the outer layer are places where even bandits come, according to the Heidelbergensis.
Jake, I think, had a contribution to this discussion of Rome and its use as an image or an argument, if you like. Are you still with us, Jake?
I am. I don't know where my audio is going.
We can hear you.
I haven't got. Can you see me? I'm not sure. I haven't got my headphones.
Yeah.
It's just a point that William Watson in Celtic Place Names of Scotland, he talks about the loan word of Latin Rome as ruum or ruiv, latterly to mean a cemetery in Highland Gaelic place names. Gives a few examples. It was just on the back of what Duncan was saying. Really, that's all. Not really a question.
Okay.
I was just throw it in there. And thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Do you see Alice, shall we? And we've got a question from Carol about the well at Iona and other possible things that it might reflect or relate to. Carol, would you like to ask it yourself, or shall I ask it for you?
I'll go ahead. Okay. Hello, thank you for that. It was very interesting, Gilbert. Great to see you.
Nice to see you, yeah.
This is just something I was wondering. I don't know if anyone has ever brought this up, but do you think there might be a relationship between the well at Iona and its position in relation to the church, to the Holocaust? You talked about Jerusalem of the present in Iona's time, the time we're talking about here, and then the Jerusalem of the future, the heavenly Jerusalem. There was also the Jerusalem of the past, which Augustine talks about, and also Bede. And so there are the Old Testament and descriptions, and also the writings like those of Josephus about Jerusalem. I was thinking possibly the Holocaust, which figures in that layout of the area around the tabernacle and around the temple. Could that have some kind of relationship? Do you know of anything textual or other examples?
I haven't really thought about that, but my immediate intuitive reaction is that water and Holocaust don't go well together. The water would extinguish your Holocaust.
But in the Codex Amiatinus, the Holocaust is a vase filled with water.
Is a what?
It has water.
Oh.
Water. A vase filled with water. Do you know it? The big, like an amphora. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the manuscript. I know the manuscript, but I can't conjure up the image in my mind. Okay.
Yeah. Well, have a look at it sometime.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. My intuitive response is to think that the Holocaust would primarily be associated with the altar in the church as the principal place of offering.
But in the biblical descriptions, and also in the Codex Amiatinus, it is shown outside the sanctuary, in the forecourt.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's like an amphora. Have a look at it. I'll send you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I'll send you a picture.
Interesting, but yeah, please do. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right. Anyway, thanks again. Just an idea.
Thank you very much, Carol. Yeah.
Bye.
People keep sending questions.
I've got nowhere to go.
Right, Brian,
I was sad.
you make it in under the wire. Would you like to ask your question? Oh, Brian, I think maybe you've frozen. You're always moving. Are you moving?
Something moving.
Yeah.
It's like wind moving from.
Well, I can't speak. Brian, would you like me to ask your question for you? Yes. Just a point here that that there are many stories about Rome burials being created by the saint scattering clay from Rome, and then the cemetery then becomes equal for indulgences as burial in Rome itself.
That's absolutely right, Brian.
Yeah. Right.
And it also saves you going there. You get the spiritual benefit. You can get the spiritual benefit of going to Rome by just going to your local parish church or monastery.
So, any last thoughts, questions, points? I'm fetching a time. Hörskafel but a reach some paper point, just but snogs this Cora line. Thank you again so much for lovely paper and for the discussion and for having such a good response to everybody's questions. And let's do